We are now talking to fantasy pros and dynasty nerds fantasy football writer, Garrett Price. What's going on, Garrett?
Not too much, guys. How are you doing?
Oh, well, we're not dancing. We got my co-host over here has a headache that he's trying to slowly but surely for the 3-hour show make it through the show. But I told him before we got you on, if you want an ibuprofen or Advil, I can get you one. He says no need for it. So, but anyways, tell us a little bit about yourself and how did you start doing fantasy and really doing the things that you're doing with fantasy football?
Yeah, so I've been doing fantasy football from a podcasting standpoint for about 3 years now. And, it was one of those situations where it was better to be lucky than good, honestly, more than anything. I was doing some writing for like my home league. We all have these home leagues we're in with our buddies and we trash talk. And then halfway through the season, half the people forget about the league and you know how those go. And so every week I was that dude that was like doing a write-up for the league and like just talking about what players I thought were going to do well, what teams were hot garbage and, all this kind of stuff. And one of my buddies came up to me and he's like, Garrett, those write-ups you do, they're actually pretty good. Like you should do it for people that care. It's like, okay. And I just so happened right at that same time, I was listening to a podcast, the Dynasty Nerds Fantasy Football Podcast, which was the largest dynasty podcast out there. I was listening to it and they were looking for some writers and I was like, shoot, I'm going to apply. Let's see how it goes. And I applied. They liked the stuff. And come to find out, I didn't even know it at the time. I only lived about an hour away from the guys that were doing the show. So they invited me to come do a guest spot. 3 years later, now I own part of the company. So it's crazy how these things go.
Well, it's a little that's a little crazy. You go from just being a writer to now being one of the owners. So
exactly,
money talks, baby. Money talks. So why don't we get into your Ohio State Buckeyes? Because Speedy Petey over here told me that you're a Buckeyes fan. And before we get into the NFL, I have to get into this because all year I've been saying this is the year Michigan's going to knock off Ohio State. Everybody thought I was nuts. Now all of a sudden Michigan destroys Ohio State, and now all the excuses come out. Oh, Ohio State's not built for the cold. They're not built for the snow. They're not built for the bad weather. So what was your thoughts after this complete, utter craziness after Michigan knocks off finally the Ohio State Buckeyes for at least, I think, 10 years? I mean, it's been forever.
It's been a while.
Yes.
It's been a while. Yeah, so I do my best to be as unbiased as humanly possible, which is tough to do. You're a fan. You love your team. You root for your boys. But I try my best to be as impartial as possible. But really what happened was their defensive line dominated our offensive line. I mean, they were rushing the quarterback well. They were stopping the run. TreVeyon Henderson, one of the best running backs in the country, wasn't hardly doing anything that game. And they were running the ball down our throat, and our linebackers just couldn't fill the holes, couldn't fill the gaps. It was just, it was more of this old school mentality, and they beat us up, which is embarrassing to say. I hate it. It ticked me off, but that's really what happened. So but as much as I was frustrated, as much as I was angered by this situation that happened, it's good for the Big Ten and it's good for the rivalry, because anytime a rivalry becomes too one-sided, it's not as much fun anymore. You want that anybody could win at any time, any year. Right. So I think it's going to help breathe a little bit more life back into this great rivalry.
Look at the smile on Jim Harbaugh, by the way.
Can't stand that guy. Get your khaki pants out of here.
I loved his smile after they interviewed him. I've never seen a bigger smirk. It looked like he won the Super Bowl.
Yeah. Well, for him it was. He was 0-5, so he needed that.
So do you think this particular game and also this particular season says more about Ohio State maybe being a little flawed in some areas? I always said their offensive line and their defensive line this year have been down from what they usually are. You mentioned TreVeyon Henderson doing very well, and obviously they got the two great receivers with Olave and Wilson as well. But what do you think it was for Ohio State more, or do you think Michigan was just that good and maybe proved themselves to be better than a lot of people expected, especially after collapsing the way they did against Michigan State?
Yeah, I think it's probably a little bit of both. I think Michigan is better than most people, including myself, gave them credit for. They have some legitimate defensive linemen. I mean, them boys can hunt. I got to give credit where credit's due. They were better than I thought they were. But, anytime we have a young team overall too, our starting quarterback's a freshman, our starting running back's a freshman. We brought in some new linemen, it was just a younger team, and defensively, I think that's the biggest frustration of all of this is just defensively, we're nowhere near where we've been in the past where, we're producing, a bunch of first-round DBs. We're producing a bunch of first-round defensive linemen. We have all and we just don't really have that on this team right now. There might be a couple freshmen that become that, but we don't have those junior and senior leaders that you just go to and you're like, these dudes are studs. They're going to step up in big games, and I think that was the difference.
So we're talking about Michigan and Ohio State. Obviously, their alumni list in the NFL is pages upon pages long. So, obviously, now we see Micah Parsons, who's probably going to win Defensive Rookie of the Year as well, who came in and took the Cowboys' defense, which was awful last year, and catapulted them to now winning the NFC East. Is there a guy you're looking at in this NFL draft that might not be getting the spotlight that everyone should be looking at?
Yeah, so, I don't know that there's anybody that is out of the spotlight, but Thibodeau out of Oregon, he looks like he could be the real deal. He could really be one of those players, but I don't have anybody on the defensive side of the football anyway that I would say is like really under the radar that's going to turn out as well as somebody like a Micah Parsons where, he's not even just a defensive rookie of the year candidate. He's a defensive player of the year candidate with how well he's playing. So I don't know that we have anybody quite that talented in this class, but there's definitely some good prospects and a lot of depth on the edge rushing side of the ball there.
We are talking to Fantasy Pros and Dynasty Nerds fantasy football writer Garrett Price. So why don't we get into some NFL conversation? Obviously, we're here in New York. Your thoughts to Dave Gettleman, obviously, the acquisitions he made in the offseason. Obviously, you've heard that Odell Beckham was available. Giant fans were jumping. Let's bring him back. Let's reunite him with this team. It didn't happen. He goes over there to the Rams. What are your thoughts to the Giants this offseason? Is Judge going to be looking for a job? Is Gettleman going to be looking for a job? Where do you see this team? And do you think Daniel Jones is the quarterback of the future of this organization?
There's a lot of good questions there, and that's been the tough part is it's been really difficult to gauge Daniel Jones because of all the injuries that they've had some offensive line issues, but then when you're talking about the skill position players, every week, Kenny Golladay, Sterling Shepard, Saquon Barkley, like all of these guys are out, and so it's really tough to judge a young quarterback when he just hasn't had the pieces to do it. So, usually the transcendent guys can make it happen no matter what. So clearly he's not that. But is he an average to above average quarterback? It's still tough to say. But NFL, a lot of people say it stands for not for long. So you got to prove it or lose it. And I think we're at the point where I just don't know that he's done enough, whether it's entirely his fault or not. I don't know that he's done enough to really prove it. And so while I think that there's still a shot that he is the starter next year, I wouldn't be shocked at all if they draft a quarterback at some point in the first 2 days of the draft. Somebody, this isn't the strongest quarterback class, but there are a lot of players with some upside here. But as far as going to Gettleman and things like that, I don't think he's done as terrible of a job as some people believe. Mm-hmm. He's actually brought in some decent talent. I'm not sold on Joe Judge. He's this old school, hard-nosed guy, and there are places for that in the league, but clearly there's something missing here because this is actually a pretty solid defense. And the offensive line is getting better, but things are just not jiving all the way. There's no cohesion. There's no excitement on this team. You can see some of those young teams that might not be very good, but you see the excitement and the passion and the, you see the upside of what it could be. You just don't feel that right now, that cohesion with the Giants. And I put a lot of that on the coaching. So as of right now, I think David Gettleman, could he be back? I think he could. I don't think he's been as bad as people think, but I'm probably out on Joe Judge.
So outside of probably Kyle Shanahan, the coach that everyone hates in the fantasy community the most is Jason Garrett. And now he's finally gone. So again, so for this season, the remainder of the season, the fantasy playoffs obviously coming up. Now Freddy Kitchens, the Giants' offensive coordinator. Do you think that maybe there are some players that benefit from that kind of scheme the most? We didn't really see it against the Eagles. They won 13-7, but it was with their defense. And also, what coach, if looking for a coach in the offseason, say Judge is gone, do you think would be the best to get the most out of these offensive players, especially if Jones is still there?
Yeah, those are good questions. So let's start with Freddy Kitchens. I'm familiar with Freddy Kitchens. He was the coach for the Browns for one season there. Freddy's a good guy. He's a good old boy. I don't think he's this offensive innovator, mastermind type guy. His history is with running backs, so this could be a slight boost maybe to Saquon Barkley. But I know that they've been tentative to really give him that full complement, that full workload, just because of all of the injuries and stuff like that. But at some point, you got to let stallions run, and the kid's a stallion. So I think with Freddy Kitchens, we might finally see Saquon Barkley really get back into this offense and get things moving. But what was your second question after that?
I was going to say, in the offseason, say they do get rid of Judge and they clean house like the coaching staff. Is there, say Daniel Jones stays, or even if he doesn't, like, is there any one coach that you think would be a big boost to those offensive players?
Yeah, so there's a couple different guys that come to mind potentially as coaches or different coordinators and things like that. But I think the guy that's going to be the envy of most teams, and now I'm blanking. It's the Carolina offensive coordinator,
Joe Brady.
Yes, yeah, I think he's probably the one that's going to be coveted the most. I think those are, we saw what he did with LSU and Joe Burrow. He hasn't had the greatest success so far with Carolina, but they're another team so far that's been it's just been a nightmare as far as injuries, and Christian McCaffrey's played 10 games.
He's out for the season now.
He's done. He's done again. There've been quarterback issues and injuries, and just it's been tough. So I think Brady's probably the one. If I had to handpick somebody, I think he would be the one that I would most likely say I would want to go after, because I think they need to get a young, fresh offensive mind. But if you're doing that, I think it's going to be similar to what we've seen with a lot of these coaches. I think he's going to want his guy. And so I think that probably does spell the end for Daniel Jones. And so they might be looking at a Sam Howell. They might be looking at a Desmond Ridder. They might be looking at a Willis from Liberty. So I think if that happens, Giants fans, unfortunately, are going to have to be ready for kind of that full turnover all over again.
I'm good with Ridder. I'm skeptical of the other ones right now.
Okay.